Hello, and welcome to this talk, Design Challenges and Solutions, Mental Health Representation in Games. I am Dr. Rachel Cowart. I am the Research Director for Take This, which is a mental health nonprofit that serves the gaming industry and gaming community. I am a research psychologist who has been studying the uses and effects of games for more than 10 years. I am joined here today by my colleague, Dr. Kelly Dunlap, who I will pass the floor to and allow her to introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Dr. Kelly Dunlap. I am the head of community at Take This. I am also a clinical psychologist and a game designer, and I teach game design at American University's Game Center.
As noted in the title, we are here today to talk about mental health representation in games. I'm going to open the talk by talking about mental health representation in media generally, touching upon some examples in games, and discuss about how that impacts our larger discussion about mental health and mental illness. Then I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Dr. Kelly Dunlap, who's going to talk about a model that we developed, the 3D model of mental health representation, as a way to better represent mental health in games. Also, content warning before we get started. This talk is going to be about mental health and mental illness, and if that is in any way upsetting or triggering for you, please feel free to step away as you need. The media has always been a source of information about mental health. Television and film portrayals, both good and bad, have long been spaces to understand, explore, educate, and tell stories about mental health and mental illness. Although historically media portrayals have been more about mental illness than mental wellness, and have often been negative, exaggerated, and inaccurate. For example, portraying individuals with mental illness as violent, criminal, and dangerous, despite the fact that individuals with mental illness are more likely to be a victim of violence than a perpetrator of one. I mean, for me, immediately, Jack Nicholson from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest comes to mind, but there are many other examples. The way mental health is represented in games diverges from the way it's traditionally represented in media, because in games, mental health can be portrayed not only in the characters and the narratives, but the game mechanics as well. Think sanity meters and in-game decisions. Although like traditional media, mental health representation in games has often also been negative, exaggerated, and inaccurate. In a study looking at mental illness portrayals in the top-selling video games between 2011 and 2013, 1/4 of them, or 24%, depicted one or more mentally ill characters. And of the 42 individual characters that were identified as portraying mental illness, 29 of them, 69%, acted violently and in line with what we would call the homicidal maniac trope. This trope has found to be particularly prevalent in games. Now, this isn't to say all mental health representation in games are bad or negative. Just most of them are. There are a few notable examples of hopeful, good, and valuable representation. We have Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, Stardew Valley, Sea of Solitude, and Celeste. But why does any of this matter? Why does the representation of mental health in games matter? Because digital games are the dominant cultural media form of the 21st century. As most of you are well aware, the industry is massive with billions of players across the globe. And the representation of mental health and mental illness in the media has wide-ranging repercussions, and this also applies to games. Previous research has found that exposure to negative media portrayals of mental illness is linked to negative stereotyped perceptions of the mentally ill, and a reduction to help-seeking behaviors for individuals with mental illness. For example, one study found that heavy viewers of television, that is, those who are exposed to high levels of media messaging, were more likely to believe that having a mental health service in the area in a residential neighborhood, that posed a danger to the residents of those neighborhoods. They also expressed a lower tolerance for people with mental illness than those with a lower level of exposure to media messaging. Media messages and images surround us and both reflect and produce the way we think about the world. The content of our media traditionally conveys our sense of cultural value by reflecting our attitudes and beliefs and priorities. And we see this in our research, and our cultural values can and do shift based on the media messages that we consume, either by reinforcing stereotypes or cultivating new thoughts and ideas. The good news is, though, just as this can be negative, it can also be positive. In 2020, a wonderful paper was published by Fashode and colleagues looking at how games, when done right, can be used to reduce mental health stigma. Drawing from a pool of almost 200 participants, they enlisted an experimental design where participants either played 45 minutes of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, or they watched gameplay footage of someone else playing it. As mentioned before, Hellblade is a fantastic example of mental health representation done right in a video game, and that is why they chose it. It has universally been praised for its accurate portrayal of psychosis. If you're unfamiliar, the main character, Senua, suffers from psychosis, and the player must navigate her quest along with her mental health. It's a pretty sweet game if you haven't checked it out. Now, after playing or watching other people play, the participants filled out various questionnaires about stigma around mental health. What they found is for those who played the game, for those who played as Senua, they reported reduced social distance between them and those with mental illness. That is, they would feel more comfortable being closer to people who exhibited signs and symptoms of mental illness. Theoretically, these findings provide the foundational work for understanding how we can use games and how we can use accurate and positive mental health representation in games to reduce stigma around mental health. And it practically illustrates that commercially available games can impact meaningful change when done right. So where do we go from here? As consumers of video games, we should be aware of how tropey, inaccurate, and exaggerated portrayals of mental health can inform our perceptions about mental health and mental illness. As game designers, we need to be more aware about the importance of our design decisions when developing games that portray mental health and mental illness. And for more on that, I will pass it to my colleague, Dr. Kelly Dunlap.
Thanks so much, Rachel. When we talk about portrayals of mental illness in media, generally there's a focus on characters. And unfortunately, as Rachel mentioned, those depictions are almost always uninformed, inaccurate, and stigmatizing. In this way, games really aren't that different from other media. However, there's more to mental health representations than just characters. For example, harmful mental illness tropes can be depicted environmentally through the use of items, medications, procedures, and locations. It can also be depicted mechanically, like through the use of sanity meters or decision trees. And that's something that's unique to games. Have you ever had a character spawn in a psych hospital and had something good happen? Probably not. This trope is especially common in horror games because mental illness, especially psychiatric institutions or interventions, is so often shorthand for be afraid. So this 3D model of mental health representation started out as an academic research project. There's not a ton of information out there about mental health representation in games, and what is out there focuses only on characters. But as we know, there's a lot of representations that aren't characters, and they don't tend to get picked up by the previous models. So the idea of the 3D model here is for us to be able to capture the wide range of ways that mental illness and mental health shows up in games and have a way of talking about it so that we're all speaking the same language and hopefully getting rid of some of the judgmental language. All right, let's take a look at one-dimensional representations. These are broad references to mental illness that are non-essential to a character, story, or environment. So in other words, they acknowledge that mental illness exists in this space, typically through passing reference or name. So for example, we have Heimskr here. He is a Nord priest and he preaches outside of Whiterun, and the villagers all refer to him as crazy old Heimskr. So there's really no reason for that to happen other than to add, again, flavor or dimensionality to the world. However, it does perpetuate this idea that individuals who are different or odd in some way are quote unquote crazy, and therefore they shouldn't be listened to, which is really funny because Heimskr is really the only one who knows what's going on in the Elder Scrolls world, but that's for another video. Now, it doesn't have to be a negative or stigmatizing representation just because it's one-dimensional. For example, in Life is Strange True Colors, Alex, the main character, finds a poster that is advertising for a group therapy that's coming up. So this isn't explored. Again, it's a passing reference, and if it was removed from the game wouldn't be any different and nobody would even notice. But the fact that it's there, it actually normalizes the experience of treatment seeking and raises the idea that maybe therapy is an okay thing to have exist in the world, but it doesn't necessarily dive deep into it. All right, let's talk two-dimensional representations. So in two-dimensional representations, the psychopathology, the mental illness, the features, the symptoms, they're all essential to or a defining element of the character, story, or setting, but they lack any kind of depth or exploration. So the game does not explore mental illness beyond the surface level. So for example, this is where our homicidal maniac trope comes in. This is where we get our Kefkas, where the villain is motivated to murder and destroy and is incredibly violent and dangerous because they are quote unquote insane or unstable or some other vague flavor of mental illness. Vas Montenegro from Far Cry 3 and Marakov from Call of Duty Modern Warfare are also examples of the extremely violent person who also apparently is violent because of their psychopathic traits or their insanity. So in other words, the psychopathology is at the core. If you removed that trait from any of those individuals, they would no longer be villains. They would no longer be characters at all. Again, two-dimensional doesn't mean bad, though. For example, Symmetra from Overwatch, one of her defining characteristics is her autistic traits, and the developers have confirmed that she is on the autism spectrum. So these traits and powers that she has defines her as who she is, and if they were removed, she would no longer be Symmetra, but they're not inherently harmful. In fact, they are an attempt to celebrate the unique differences of individuals with autism or individuals that see themselves as neurodivergent. And last but not least are three-dimensional representations. So these are characters, stories, environments, and locations that are more than just plot points or convenient backstory. They are essential and fully realized components. They're not just mental illness in a meat suit, so to speak. They are representations that have depth and dimensionality, and they examine the experience of mental illness from multiple perspectives. So of course, Senua from Hellblade is a really good example of here. She is a full character in her own right, not just psychosis walking around in a video game. So three-dimensional representations do tend to be the most complex, and with that complexity typically comes a lack of stereotype and stigma. It's not impossible. There's a lot of complicated villains like Sephiroth that you might be able to argue are three-dimensional because they have depth and they have traumatic backstories that you can dig into, and it's just one part of their experience. But for the most part, if we're really fleshing out a character or a place or a mechanic in a way that digs into mental health and mental illness in a way that is respectful and curious and exploratory, we're probably going to end up with a three-dimensional representation. All right, so let's recap. The goal of this three-dimensional model is to help game developers and game scholars better understand and communicate about the kind of mental health representations that are occurring in our games. Now, sometimes this is easy, with characters like Senua or Kefka, where we can clearly see what's going on, or it can be something as small as a poster about group therapy in Life is Strange True Colors. We as game developers have the opportunity to help destigmatize mental illness and normalize help seeking around mental health issues. And we can do that by having all of these different types of representations. So it's important as we go forward to think about if you're including mental health in your games in any way, again, from a character to a poster to a story, that we understand and think about why that representation is there. What purpose is it serving? Is it adding just flavor to the world, or are we really truly trying to understand what's going on? Is it just because we think it's what everybody does and it's a trope that we're falling into, or are we putting something there with intentionality because it normalizes an experience? All important things to think about when we're dealing with a population as vulnerable as those with mental illness. Thanks.